The next company presenting today is Egetis. And with us we have here today the CEO, Niklas Westerholm. And we have, the company basically is developing new therapies within the rare disease segment with a focus in a rare disease called MCT8 deficiency. Now I'll give you the word to you, Niklas.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo, and pleasure being there. For those I haven't had the privilege to meet before, my name is Niklas Westerholm, and I'm the CEO of Egetis Therapeutics. What I'll cover today is a quick and brief update around the company strategy, where nothing has changed, where we focus on late-stage development for commercialization and also provide a pipeline overview. Having said that, though, I'll also, of course, touch upon the recent developments, where we heard that we have terminated discussions that was issued on the press release on the 23rd of May regarding the potential acquisition of the company. I will then focus on our lead asset in the pipeline, Emcitate for the treatment of MCT8 deficiency, an overview of disease, the clinical data we generated so far, the regulatory pathway to approval in Europe and US, as well as the commercial opportunity, which I will elaborate further on. So starting off with the company, a quick reminder, again, where nothing has changed compared to what we have communicated over the last 2 years. We are an integrated orphan drug company focusing on late-stage development for commercialization. Currently today, we have 2 assets in late-stage development, Emcitate for the treatment of MCT8 deficiency and Aladote for the prevention of acute liver injury caused by paracetamol poisoning. For Emcitate, the most advanced asset, we're targeting submissions in Europe and US already this year. That to aside, we are planning to launch our products in the future through an in-house commercial organization, very focused, covering up to 50 employees, covering Europe and US, and will partnership in the rest of the world. The reason for doing so is fairly simple. It's about maximizing the value to our shareholders, but also other stakeholders in this orphan drug segment. Over the last couple of years, we have really built a strong team with focus on late-stage development in the orphan drug space, as well as experience from registration, but also most lately built start to build stepwise some further commercial and medical affairs experience ahead of launches in 2024. And in total today, we're around 25 to 30 full-time employees within the company. So starting off with, I guess, which is the key topic around the termination of discussions regarding a potential acquisition of the company, where we issued a press release last week on the 23rd of May. A quick recap is that these discussions we have had was triggered by an unsolicited approach by an external party. And subsequently, we have had, during the spring, discussions with several parties regarding an acquisition of the company. As mentioned in the press release from the board last week, the discussions has now been terminated since the board believes that the contemplated offer and terms, whilst providing a premium to the share price, considerably undervalued the long-term prospects of the company. And what we mean by that is, if we look at the coming 12 months, we really see a transformative period for the company with several near-term value-creating milestones, such as the submission to the EMA, the start of the pivotal study in the US, the ReTriact study, the readout of the same, and a submission in the US as well. So really, the board believes that create best long-term value for our shareholders is to retain the asset within the company. As a consequence of this intense process of discussions, we also announced that the timelines for the EMA submission has been moved from Q2, as originally planned, to early autumn this year. And one could of course ask the question, so what does these 2 aspects have in relationship to each other? It's fair to say there that it's 2 aspects that have a really close link to the submission. One is resources. And I need to be utterly clear there that when you are in a process regarding a potential acquisition with several parties, there are hundreds and hundreds of questions that needs to be answered. We have a small focused organization, so we needed to spend time on that. So the time for pulling together the EMA dossier wasn't there up until the decision we made. That in parallel with, of course, strategic considerations being discussed with potential external parties regarding the acquisitions, led us to postpone the EMA submission until early autumn this year. And there is very important when we say early autumn, as we all know, in contrast to the FDA, EMA has specific timelines when submission can be executed on per month, with exception of August, and we're verifying the timelines with the EMA now, in contrast to the FDA when you can submit at any point in time. We still remain confident that Emcitate is on track for the expected regulatory approvals and launches in both Europe and US next year. And from my personal perspective, I think it's very pleased to see that we have had several external parties interested in Emcitate and the company as an asset. That verifies the strong proposition Emcitate carries, but also the good job the organization have been doing over the last couple of years, despite it didn't lead to anything at this point in time. So a quick overview of the pipeline. So the lead candidate, Emcitate, for the treatment of MCT8 deficiency. Early autumn is the submission timelines for the European market. When it comes to the US market, they were looking to execute on a small randomized placebo control study to verify results we've seen in previous studies. And I'll come back to that and the status and timelines. Also, we see another additional opportunity with Emcitate in a totally different patient population that is called a resistance to thyroid hormone beta. And that's something in that indication, something we received also orphan drug designation from both EMA and the FDA last year, and they were considering a development pathway for approval to be as optimized as possible, and something we'll communicate at a later point in time. We also have Aladot for the prevention of acute liver injury caused by paracetamol poisoning. There, we're planning to start the pivotal study later this year. Obviously, as mentioned before, with the caveat of ensuring that we have enough bandwidth to do so, because as one can imagine, the priority is now, of course, the submissions in Europe and US for Emcitate. A quick overview of Emcitate then, and the disease, which is a devastating condition. So MCT8 deficiency is a mutation on the gene for transport of thyroid hormone. The transport is actually called MCT8. It's an X-linked disorder, which means that it affects mainly men, and it affects roughly 1 to 70,000 boys. So the body has different transporters of thyroid hormone, or the active thyroid hormone T3, as you can see here on the slide. Some tissues are dependent on MCT8 as a transporter. An example of that is the brain, the blood-brain barrier, etc. And some tissues are not dependent, like the cardiovascular system, the muscles, the skeleton, liver, kidney, etc. And also worthwhile recognizing is that the body's hormostat, so to say, thermostat, that regulates the production and sends signals to the thyroid gland is also MCT8 dependent, which means that in this disease you have two clinical phenotypes. You have a part or parts of the body that have overexposure of thyroid hormone, since you have excess of thyroid hormone there, like the muscles, the cardiovascular system, etc. And then you have parts of the body, like the brain and the central nervous system, that have an abundance of thyroid hormone or no thyroid hormone as well. And these two conditions, as you can see here on the slide, is called peripheral thyrotoxicosis, too much thyroid hormone in some tissues, and cerebral hypothyrotoxicosis in other parts of the body. The median life expectancy of these children with two different clinical phenotypes is 35 years old, and there's no available therapy today on the market. And just a quick elaboration on these two clinical phenotypes that exist within one person or one patient. So peripheral thyrotoxicosis, too much thyroid hormone in different tissues, leads to severely low body weight, long-term cardiovascular issues, hypertension, blood pressure, etc., pulse. And that also then translates into that most of these patients die at a very early age due to the cardiovascular issues, median life expectancy of 35 years. The other part, cerebral hypothyroidism, too low exposure or no exposure of thyroid hormone in the, for example, brain. leads to severe intellectual motor disability, very limited ability to stand and walk, ability to communicate, and requires 24/7 supportive care. So to calibrate this, only 8% of the patient population that carries this disease have an ability to sit up independently. So you can imagine that these poor children are severely affected by the disease. If you then think about the clinical experience we have with Emcitate, the solution you can see here on the right hand on the side, Emcitate is with the actual name of tiratricol, the API, is a small molecule, it's a thyroid hormone analog, and unlike the natural hormone T3, it can actually cross cellular membranes without a functional MCT8 transporter. It's a very neat mechanistic solution, which really addresses both challenges and both clinical phenotypes in the body. It normalizes the thyroid hormone in both compartments. So in the compartment where you have too high levels of thyroid hormone, it normalizes this. In the compartment we have had no exposure in the past, it also addresses that. So that is Emcitate and the mechanistic rationale behind it. We had the first clinical trial that was completed in 2019 and published in Lancet, 46 patients, where it was studied what one would call the peripheral thyrotoxicosis side of the disease, i.e. normalizing thyroid hormone levels in the peripheral part of the body, in the serum. As an example here, you see the primary endpoint where we were able to normalize it. The orange dots are patient's T3 level at baseline, and the arrow shows it after 12 months of treatment with Emcitate. And as one can see here on the slide, more or less all patients were able to be normalized within the normal range of T3. And that then translated into some very important clinical relevant outcome measures, such as improved body weight, heart rate, other cardiovascular parameters. We also have additional clinical data that was published in 2021, October, where we, under a 6-year period in a real-world evidence setting, it's called the Erasmus Medical Center cohort study, were able to follow 67 patients up to 6 years. And we saw exactly the same thing here, i.e. verification, that more or less all patients were normalized very fast, according to the first previous slide I showed you in the first clinical trial, but also durable of up to 6 years. That led us then to engage with regulatory authorities with the argument that we now have 2 different and independent cohorts of clinical data, the TRIAC Trial 1 and the EMC cohort study, and we believe that that's in a rare disease setting should be sufficient for a submission. The EMA concluded and agreed on that in a pre-submission meeting, and here, as I mentioned earlier, we are planning for a submission early autumn this year, based on the data we already have at hand. For the US, they actually recognized the good and solid data we have and also confirmed that normalization of T3 levels and the clinical manifestations it has on thyrotoxicosis, peripheral thyrotoxicosis, serve as a basis for approval. However, they wanted us to verify the results we have seen so far in a very small randomized placebo-controlled study in 16 patients for 30 days, since the data we have generated so far is from an open label study. That study is something that will start very shortly. Here we have had some challenges over the last 4 to 6 months in order to start that. So a step back is that the design was agreed with the FDA already in Q4 last year. We have 3 sites participating in this study: Children's Hospital Philadelphia, Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam, and Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge. What we saw when we were planning to initiate and start the study was that the first study to be initiated was the Children's Hospital Philadelphia, and there we saw hospital administration driven by COVID-19 was a big blocker, so external factors, where they had in queue more than 30 different projects to start studies. So there was a bottleneck within the so-called budget department at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. We didn't get a buy-in and approval from the budget department until February this year, and subsequently submitted it to the IRBs or ethics committees around February, March. In parallel with that, as one always do, we have discussions with different regulatory authorities. We also got some comments that we communicated in April, where we received some comments on study documentation. So not design, let me be utterly clear, but study documentation, which required an update of the study documentation, which then necessitate a resubmission to the ethics committees for a renewed approval. That was done during back end of April with a very quick turnaround. And here we received the first ethics committee's approval back end of last week. So we should be ready to start and have the first patient in now during Q2 as previously communicated. We have also worked, of course, in parallel with streamlining the study, making sure that the recruitment timelines is as swift as possible. There we have 33 patients lined up or identified across the 3 different sites. So we believe the recruitment will be quick. And we also looked at the back end of the process, i.e. data cleaning and database lock in order to announce results as soon as possible. So that's the status of the ReTRIACt study, which is hopefully to be started as soon as possible. Translating that into the commercial opportunity and how we see that, I think it's very important again to recognize that we have already 180 patients, around 180 patients, being treated with Emcitate outside our clinical programs, which really verifies a number of things. The unmet medical need, of course, that the patients are out there, the physician's willingness to prescribe Emcitate as a treatment. But also very important is that these patients will, of course, at the point of approval, transfer over to commercial payers. So based on that, we also believe that the revenue will start off at a decent base rather than zero at the point of approval. So commercializing of Emcitate, as I mentioned before, we're planning to do this through an own very lean in-house commercial organization covering around 40 to 50 employees across Europe and US and looking for partnerships in the rest of the world. And that's driven by a few factors that you see here on the screen: substantial unmet medical need, centralized focus target groups that are prescribers, pediatric endocrinologists and pediatric neurologists, and it's no competition and no treatment out there. We're focusing very hard on this and we're building up the commercial infrastructure stepwise. Obviously, we put that in contrast with submission timelines and approval timelines. So here we have a flexible cost base going forward, but focusing on 2 aspects really. One is identifying patients to drive disease awareness, educate around the disease, diagnosis and newborn screening. And the other part is, of course, ensure and drive as broad access as possible for Emcitate as soon as possible after marketing authorization. I won't go through this in detail since we have limited time, but there is a number of activities we're doing around disease awareness education, collaboration with patient advocacy groups, and putting together national and international advisory boards around newborn screening, etc. Being present, of course, now since COVID-19 is not impacting the scientific conferences. We have had great traction there, speaking to physicians around the disease, as well as a mix of other channels in order to do the same. When it comes to market access or ensuring access, of course, one key element of the organization is developing a compelling clinical and economical value proposition to ensure as broad as possible reimbursement and access. And we're doing so by generating data around the disease, via so-called caregiver studies or patient journey studies or vignette studies in order to really calibrate and illustrate the impact it has on caregivers, the parents, etc., and the hospital setting, and what benefits would Emcitate provide from an economical standpoint. Last but not least, but not to dwell on this before, just to calibrate the opportunity we see from a pricing perspective. And this is a slide reflecting the US market. We have not giving guidance from a company perspective on Emcitate in particular, but in order to calibrate that, We see some of the analogs you see here on the slide as good proxies when it comes to list price, and these analogs are selected based on similar type of treatment and disease areas, such as ultra-orphan condition, pediatric patient population, no treatment options exist, chronic treatment during the whole of lifetime, and the same disease severity. And as you can see on the bottom of the slide, these analogs reflect a very decent premium-priced drug. So with that, to conclude, we believe we have a company that are very much advanced in the development space. We have strong and consistent clinical data demonstrating significant effects on key clinical outcomes. We believe that since we have passed most of the typical drug development risks, we have a very high likelihood of reaching the market in 2024, where we have all clinical data already available for a submission in Europe, and we're doing a short, small reconfirming trial in the US, which carries, in our view, a very low risk that leads us to a submission towards the back end of the year. And that comes then based on the prevalence we discussed and pricing with a commercial opportunity that's very good. And last but not least, we also are eligible, worthwhile recognizing, for a priority review voucher upon US approval, which can be sold, of course, to another sponsor. With that, thank you very much. And I guess, Gonzalo, you have some questions.
Yes, no, thank you very much, Niklas. Very interesting presentation. Time for a few questions. I mean, now it seems that things are aligning for the submissions, both in Europe and in the US. And I was thinking, like, assuming that you reach the market, one of the challenges that a company like you targeting this type of rare disease to that level is diagnosis. I mean, you of course are assuming an incidence of 1 in between 70,000, but diagnosis will be a challenge, or it will be something you would have to face once you're in the market. How much is in your hands that you can actually increase diagnosis or like implement, let's say in the future, screening for patients, for newborns? I mean, how much can you do to increase diagnosis?
I think it's an excellent question, Gonzalo. I think the end game, of course, is having this as part of newborn screening. And there's a good rationale for that. It's simple and it's cheap. It's a simple T3 test. It costs $1.50 and it's available in most of the labs, right? So it's a good rationale behind it, considering the detrimental condition of MCT8 deficiency. That happening before approval is highly unlikely. You usually need to have a treatment on the market before you actually get into newborn screening processes in the respective countries. So it's quite a heavy lift. Having said that, though, based on the activities we do already, we already see traction. So being present at conferences, establishing key opinion leader networks, etc. Discussing with gene diagnostic companies. I think I mentioned to you before that just by approaching a couple of gene diagnostic companies in the US, we found in their database more than 40 patients already being diagnosed with MCT8 deficiency that we didn't know about. That in combination with having also already 180 patients on treatment today, which hopefully will increase before approval, serves a very good base to start off with in order to drive this forward post-approval.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I have a second question is on your US small trial that will start soon. Could you give us some background of the patients that you will include in that study? Because I mean, you can go through that very fast, but I mean, those patients are already on treatment, and what you will do is half of them will stop having treatment, and the others will continue.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. So of course, I should have mentioned that. Apologize. So for this study, the majority of the patients will be sourced from our patients already under the named patient use program. So these are patients on treatment that will be randomized to be continued on treatment or actually receiving placebo under an up to a 30-day period. And this primary endpoint is very simple. It's the proportion of patients in the respective treat group that reaches upper limit normal of T3, the blue corridor you saw on a previous slide. And there we expect, if not all, the majority of the patients in the placebo arm go up to upper limit normal even within days up to a week. And that's driven by data we have from previous patients that's been on drug holiday, but also the half-life of the compound is 5 to 6 hours. And we also believe, based on what you see, the clinical data we have at hand, that the majority, if not all, of the patients that are continue to be on treatment will stay within the normal range. So you're absolutely right that the source of patients for this study will be patients in majority that's been on treatment before and age above 4 years old to make sure that it's stable.
For how long can these patients, I mean, do you have a criteria like these patients must have been in treatment for X amount of months or something like that?
No, what we do is that and that's a very good question, is that when we identify the patients and they come in for screening, they actually will be monitored the first couple of weeks before they're being randomized to ensure, to mitigate any risk, that they are stable within the normal range and towards the bottom end. So we're not just randomizing at day one, we're making sure that they are stable and so on treatment.
Great. And one last question is on the other indication that you have mentioned before, the RTH beta. That indication is, of course, it's larger than MCT8 deficiency. And I was thinking, in terms of clinical development, is it something you would like to do alone, or you would need to do it with someone? And when would you think to start like a potential clinical program there?
It's a really good question. That's also a sizable opportunity. So I think you're absolutely right there. We need to think about the strategic elements and the tactics here, since we believe that we have a good and robust safety database already, as you know from the experience in this patient population we're talking about now, MCT8 deficiency. We believe that from an efficacy standpoint, it's highly likely that we only need to do one single pivotal trial. And the reason for saying it is that we have close to 10 patients already being treated with MCT8 on the indication resistant to thyroid hormone beta in the UK. And we have some nice data coming out of that. So we believe that if we can develop a very clever design, optimize that, one single pivotal study will do. Because obviously the resistant thyroid hormone beta is also ultra-orphan condition one. It's somewhat more prevalent than MCT8 deficiency. It affects roughly 1 to 40,000 in the general population, but still. So that is the approach.
Great. I think we're running out of time. Niklas, thank you very much for being here with us today and for the presentation.
Thank you.